grew up, I was born in mid 80s, child of the 90s, typical victim of, 100 calorie packs and SnackWells and like all the like sugar-free stuff that we were told we had to stick to as kids with type 1. And really, I had a grandmother who just phenomenal baker. And when I was diagnosed, like she really took it upon herself to learn how to make all these things that she was famous for making, but in a way that was good for me. And so it really kind of, especially as I got older, like preteen, teenager, college, really got my wheels turning of like, there's a way to do this that doesn't make things taste like crap.
Welcome to the Type 1 and Midlife podcast. My name is Melissa Slemp, a certified nutritional health coach and the founder and CEO of Abundant Health with Melissa, where I help women with type 1 diabetes to feel more empowered and live their best life despite their diagnosis. Each week, I will bring conversations and strategies from guest experts and my experience living with type 1 for over 40 years now. So if you're a woman ready to redefine how diabetes can look and feel for you, then the Type 1 and Midlife podcast is the show for you. Hello and welcome to this episode. Today you hear an inspiring journey from Mary Ellen Phipps. She is a renowned cookbook author and registered dietitian and the driving force behind milkandhoneynutrition.com. In our conversation, Mary Ellen shares her personal experience with type 1 diabetes, a journey that was influenced by having a younger brother with the same condition. We delve into how Mary Ellen's passion for nutrition led her to establish Milk and Honey Nutrition, a platform dedicated to diabetes care and overall well-being. Throughout our discussion, we touch upon various crucial topics, including the profound emotional impact in diabetes care and the transformative power of intentional eating. Mary Ellen guides us through the 9 food principles that serve as the foundation for diabetes-friendly nutrition, emphasizing the significance of identifying foods that make you feel good. We debunk the myths and address the prevalence of misinformation found on the internet, shedding light on the truth about diabetes. Learn some practical tips for grocery shopping and the importance of planning ahead in diabetes management, and shared learned insights into keeping a well-stocked pantry featuring 12 essential ingredients. We explore blood sugar-friendly desserts, including innovative strategies such as incorporating avocados, and get some baking tips for creating healthy desserts using almond flour, oat flour, and plain Greek yogurt. Mary Ellen challenges the labeling of the diabetes diet, highlighting its lack of a one-size-fits-all approach. Discover the 2 invaluable resources authored by Mary Ellen, namely the Easy Diabetes Cookbook and the Easy Diabetes Desserts Cookbook, both offering nutrition information for every recipe. Join us as we bridge gaps within the diabetes community, prevent rapid fluctuations in blood sugar levels, and how we can embrace the empowering force of nutrition in our lives. Together, we aim to support the diabetes community in this amazing conversation with Mary Ellen Phipps. Listen in. Just a reminder that nothing you hear on this Type 1 and Midlife podcast should be a substitute for professional medical advice. Please always consult your medical professional before changing your diet, insulin dosages, or healthcare plan. Well, hello and welcome. I am here today with Mary Ellen Phipps. I'm so happy to have met you, Mary Ellen, and today we get a chance to learn more about you. So how are you doing today? Happy you're here.
Yes, thank you for having me. I am doing good. I have a little bit of a scratchy throat. I am uber competitive swim team mom, cheering on my kids last night, and I think went a little too hard, but they both ended up winning their races. So
Woohoo!
Very happy and proud of them for that. But I'm good.
That.
I'm excited to be here and chat about life with type 1.
Life with type 1, yeah, definitely. And if you would take a minute or two just to kind of share your diagnosis story and about your life with diabetes now.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I was diagnosed when I was 5 years old.
Mm.
And I'm now 37. So you can do the math, going on 32 years. Actually, and it'll be 32 years in August. And I actually had a very unique experience being diagnosed. I didn't end up in DKA. I didn't end up in the ICU. This would have been back in like I think it was 1991, because my mom has type 1. She
Oh.
was actually got grew up her whole life without it, and her older sister had type 1. She was diagnosed like maybe 5 years before she was, early 80s. And then they think she was like more of a LATA situation, but they didn't know
Mm.
what LATA was back then.
Mhm.
And then my mom got pregnant with me. And very quickly, she had no risk factors for gestational diabetes, but all of a sudden, she was like needing insulin right away, diagnosed with gestational diabetes, and her doctor was kind of like, "Oh, that's weird, but okay." I was her first pregnancy, all of that. And so then she gave birth to me. And the funny story I always like to tell is that Dairy Queen had just come out with the Blizzard when she was pregnant with me. And so they had told her, once you give birth, the gestational diabetes will go away. Like, you can go back to eating as you
Mm.
regularly would. So she had my dad go get her a Blizzard because she desperately wanted one. Well, she ate it. Her blood sugar went through the roof. And they were like, well, sorry to tell you, this is now type 1. And so
Mm.
she was 25 at the time. So then fast forward, she's been living with it for 5 years, and she starts to notice me as a 5-year-old, like losing weight, kind of being prone to sickness over like a period of about 6 months, yeast infections, wetting the bed, all of a
Mm.
sudden, kind of what we typically see in young girls who are going to be diagnosed. So she called up the pediatrician, and the pediatrician was like, no, no, you're being paranoid. And so in true mama bear mode, she took me up to the pediatrician, and like without an appointment, marched into his office and tested my blood sugar in the office, and it was like over 300.
Mm.
And so they sent us very quickly down to Cook Children's in Fort Worth. And I think I spent like about a week there, but never ended up in DK or anything like that. And it's kind of been like that ever since. I do have a very unique experience because having my aunt and my mom with type 1 growing up, like it wasn't a new thing for our family.
Mhm. Mhm.
Certainly wasn't easy by any means, especially for them having a child with type 1, but it was a different experience than a lot of people have. And
Yeah,
now
yeah,
fast
most
forward,
definitely.
I have a younger brother who never developed it, but one of his kids has it. Was
Wow.
diagnosed a few years ago. So
Isn't that incredible? Just
yeah.
proof that it's and back in the day, because I remember when I was diagnosed back in early 80s, type 1 wasn't considered genetic. It really wasn't, but we're seeing proof of that now.
Yeah.
And you're just you're another story of that connection.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you've written books, and I love what you do because I love to cook, I love to bake, and I love your philosophy with balanced. And I'm really excited to talk about this and to share with our listeners about how we can bake, we can eat, we can enjoy food. There's no deprivation living with diabetes or without diabetes, So tell me something like with have you always, with your cooking and your cookbooks that you've written and who you serve, have you always focused on the diabetic community?
Yes and no. So like I grew up, I was born in mid 80s, child of the 90s, typical victim of, 100-calorie packs and
Yeah.
SnackWells and like all the like sugar-free stuff that we were told we had to stick to as kids with
Mm-hmm.
type 1. And really I had a grandmother who just phenomenal baker. And when I was diagnosed, like she really took it upon herself to learn how to make all these things that she was famous for making, but in a way that was good for me. And so it really kind of, especially as I got older, like preteen, teenager, college, really got my wheels turning of like, there's a way to do this that doesn't make things taste like crap, quite honestly.
Exactly.
And so
Uh-huh.
that was kind of where that came from initially. So I went to college, decided I wanted to be a dietitian, then went to grad school. And I actually started my career in an endocrinologist's office, just doing diabetes
Mm.
education. That was my first job. And I hated it. Like I would come home from work wanting to throw my own pump against the wall. Like I think it was just too much.
Mm.
And so then I moved on to corporate wellness, which I absolutely loved. And the only reason I gave that up was because I wanted more time with my kids. By that point,
Mm.
I'd had my two girls. And so I made the decision to stay home. And then again was like, I am not meant to be a full-time stay-at-home mom. And so wanted to do something. And so then Milk and Honey Nutrition was born. And I kind of didn't really know where it was going to go, but it has morphed into this. My time at doing corporate wellness really prepared me for this media world of
Mm.
nutrition and diabetes. I initially did see clients one-on-one, but then when I realized like the ability to do like blogging and reach more people, and like people were starting to turn social media into their own brand and a business, and I was like, I want to do that.
Yeah.
Because one thing I had noticed in the like my very first job out of school is like I'd be sitting with a patient, like whether they were a newly diagnosed type 1 or even someone with like we would see type 2 all the time,
Mm-hmm.
is like things would go great in the office. They'd get it, we'd be rolling, they'd be doing great, and then they'd come back in their like 3 to 6 months, whatever the follow-up was, and they'd be struggling, and or they
Mm.
like wouldn't have done what we'd asked them to do. And it's like, well, where was the disconnect? And so my goal with my platforms and my cookbooks and my philosophy and everything is to be the bridge that takes what you've learned in the office, what you know you have to do, and provide tools and resources to get you over that bridge to where you need to be.
Mm.
So that's kind of what fuels everything on my blog and social media channels and the cookbooks and all the speaking things I do and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's perfect. So you've given people the tools to be able to to learn it and to sustain these practices. And
Right.
you're probably similar to I am too, because it took me a while with food. It did. I struggled for years. I didn't know what I was doing when I was in my 20s, another indicator of my blood sugar not being as stable. And so now learning and applying it. And this is what I try to coach too, is it really is a lifestyle, and it shouldn't be a burden to learn how to cook or to be a better, whether it's meal prepping, meal planning, and all of that. Hopefully they can get to that point where it just comes natural and it's just
Yeah.
part of what they can easily sustain, and rather it being another thing that they hate about their diabetes, or, trying to keep the blood sugar and their health in balance. So yeah, that's really good. And this kind of leads me to your 9 food principles. This is a perfect segue. So if you wouldn't mind, if we would just kind of dive into those 9, because I know 9's a lot, but I know how they kind of bump up against each other, and they all make sense. And yeah, we would love to hear more.
Yeah, I can kind of run through it. I have them in front of me. So, I mean, first, I always tell people like just say no to changing who you are. And the way this is relevant to the diabetes community is quick Google search, and you will see there are many different people out there sharing many different ways that are
Yeah.
supposedly, I'm using air quotes, the right way to eat
Mm-hmm.
for diabetes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's incredibly confusing, especially if you're newly diagnosed. And I think a lot of people think there's just this box and you have to fit into it and that's it. When in reality, we are all biologically different. We are all physiologically different. We all have different lifestyles. We all have different needs. And you get to determine what is best for you. Because I think a lot of that was missing in like the 80s and 90s in diabetes care was the consideration of the emotional impact of what we are asking these people to do for their physical health. And so now I think we've gotten a lot better about doing that. So make sure
I
that you're
totally agree. Mm-hmm.
adopting changes and health goals that don't make your life harder, kind of what we were saying. Number 2 is just kind of as a result of, again, a child of the 80s and 90s of prioritize your health over body size. So a lot of times people will get diagnosed. This is more in the type 2 realm that I see, but it happens to people diagnosed with type 1 as well. Doctors will just say, well, if you lose weight, it'll be easier. And then they're left at that. Where I say, no, our goal is to get your blood sugars balanced and in range as often as possible. That's our primary goal. If you decide you want to have other goals after that, then we can focus on that. But my goal is your health and not changing your body size. Number 3, make eating an active, intentional activity. And this you can come at this from both ways, but just not letting it be this passive thing that we don't give a whole lot of thought to. Now, it doesn't have to be the whole thing where it's like, oh, you have to sit down and do this and make it like this. But it's like, well, like for me, if I work from home, and so I make sure to leave my office to eat a meal or something so that I'm not distracted doing something else. It can also be something, it doesn't have to be a full-on like meal prep approach, but it can be simply sitting down and thinking through, okay, what are we going to have for dinner for the next like 3 or 4 nights? But just make it a little bit more intentional. The nature of our culture and society is food often becomes passive, but I think we lose a lot of the emotional benefit we get from food when we do that. Number 4, don't eat too fast. Enjoy your food, savor it. Again, that's the emotional side of eating that I'm a firm believer in. Food is meant to give us both physical nourishment, but also emotional nourishment. And I think a lot of times we forget that. Number 5, plan out your weeks. Like I said, you don't have to be like this meal prep genius, but simply thinking ahead, especially when it comes to managing blood sugars, knowing what's coming. We all know now, like, the power of a pre-bolus in drastically changing A1C and time and range numbers. And if you're not thinking ahead about what you're going to be having, it can make doing a pre-bolus kind of difficult. Number 6, identify foods that don't make you feel good. And this kind of gets at like just these trends of like, oh, I need to go gluten-free. Oh, I need to go dairy-free. Oh, I need to do this. It's like, well, no, if you're feeling good and we don't have any reason to, let's not cut those out. But if you genuinely don't feel good after eating something, then maybe that's not something you should be eating. It also goes along with this fine balance of enjoying food, letting food bring you emotional nourishment. But the example I always give is like, Thanksgiving is like one of my favorite holidays, like just the food and family together and everything. But it's a hard day for people with diabetes because of the super like carb heavy foods and timing things and not always having exact counts. But I know that if I like were to just like pile it all on and do all that and eat it, I'm not going to physically feel well after that. And so being more intentional about like, the pecan pie is not worth to me what I would feel afterwards. Now, pumpkin pie, that's a different story. I love pumpkin pie, but just kind of you,
right, as
your own person and having autonomy over yourself, you get to decide, do I want the emotional benefit of this? And is it going to make me feel bad later? Am I okay with that? Kind of all those decisions, but really just emphasizing to people, you're the one who gets to make that decision.
Yeah.
You don't have to let people pressure you into that. Number 7, prioritize all meals. Breakfast is important, but it isn't the most important. They are all important. Number 8, don't believe the hype. There's a lot of people on the internet, and even more so with TikTok these days, who just really don't know what they're talking about. And it's very sensationalistic. If something seems too good to be true or seems weird, or they're, the kind of running joke in dietitian circles is if it's someone with their shirt off yelling at you about like, this food is full of toxins, just look at the overall picture. There's a reason they're trying to like rope you in with these sensationalistic
there generally
claims.
is a reason.
Number 9, you do you. It circles back to what we talked about at the beginning. You deserve to enjoy your food. You deserve to eat in a way that works for your lifestyle. And this is true for people with diabetes and people without diabetes. Like, you don't have to fit into a box that someone tells you is the quote unquote best way to eat. You get to decide that for yourself.
Yeah. I love all that. It's so good. And it all fits together. It does start with our relationship with food too, especially upon diagnosis, because that can be, I think it depends on who you're working with, whether it's it's just your endocrinologist office or a dietitian like yourself. But, there's those labels of good and bad food, good carbs, bad carbs. And, I will admit, I've been up and down the different paths of carbohydrates, and I've gotten to the point where it's not a priority on my plate, but I'm not afraid to add it in. I tend to go, I tend to go more with the non-starchy vegetables because, again, because those are where the vitamins and minerals are, and that's where the nutrients really lay. So I'd rather get satisfied with nutrient-dense food rather than relying on the breads, the pastas, and all that. But that doesn't say we can't enjoy it. And you, a lot of your recipes too, I've looked through your recipes, they look amazing. It really is about balanced. So explain what your, this is kind of a phrase I use is balanced plate. That term's been used for years, hasn't it?
Yeah.
But it's different, I think, for all of us. And we don't necessarily even just have to be blood sugar conscious to benefit from a balanced plate.
Yes, excuse me, I was clearing my throat.
Okay.
So my whole approach, and so also keep in mind, so I have type 1, but my platforms exist for people with all types of diabetes, because what I say at the end of the day is, yes, they're different diseases, but I want to unify the diabetes community across the board, because at the end of the day, we're all trying to manage blood sugars. That's what we're trying to do. We are diagnosed for different reasons. There's different causes and there's different treatments, but at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do. And the nutritional approach, if you're actually trying to keep blood sugars in range and steady, is the same. And so my approach is fat, fiber, protein. Whether you have gestational diabetes, type 2, prediabetes, type 1, we want to prevent rapid fluctuation in blood sugars. And the way we do that is we introduce foods that take longer to digest. Carbohydrates are the easiest, like starches and sugars are the easiest for our bodies to digest. So it happens very quickly. And that's why you're going to get like a spike in blood sugar. That's why we have a pre-bolus time when we're injecting supposedly rapid-acting insulin, because even though it's called rapid-acting insulin, we all know it doesn't just kick in like that. It needs a load-in time, and you've got to give that injected insulin time to catch up to the food. But what we can do, because one thing I figured out very early on is that, especially as an adult, and like I've got young kids and we're all over the place, I don't always have that 20 minutes to do a pre-bolus. But if I add enough fat, fiber, and protein to my meal, I can shrink down that pre-bolus time that I need, because fat, fiber, and protein take a lot longer to digest. Fat taking the longest, and then fiber and protein being somewhere in between the carbs and the fat. But when you say balanced plate, that's what I think of, because every time we eat, making sure that, we've got those in there. And so it's something as simple as you were talking about breads and pastas. Instead of eating, a piece of white bread by itself, I'm going to say, okay, let's spread some avocado slices on top and let's do some scrambled eggs on top. And you've got a much more complete meal. You've got fiber in the avocado added, you've got fat in the avocado and egg added, and you've got protein in the egg added. And so the problem I run into though with people is they're like, oh, but because we still have people in this mindset of, oh, but it's so many calories. And it's like, oh my gosh, if I could remove
we are calorie conscious, aren't we? Yeah, that is so true.
But no, that's kind of the approach I take to eating for blood sugars. Eating to, again, because remember that goal is, I always tell people is, we want to think of a roller coaster, the blood sugar roller coaster. You don't want the big, like Six Flags massive up and down roller coaster. You want the little kiddie coaster that you're going to put your toddler on, that just has nice, easy waves in it. So that's
and it helps the way we feel. And it, obviously, because high and low blood sugars don't make us feel good. Our energy, our mood, and all of that affects how we react. And then that kind of adds a negative tone to what we're eating. All that kind of goes around in the same circle. But you talked about calories too, and it does not really go back to. And this is probably where you can. Definitely come in as educating them about food, because in general, people don't understand food, especially carbohydrates. I have women that come to me and they just don't understand what they're looking at on a plate and really where the carbs are, which is, it takes time. It takes time for them just to recognize what may have more fiber or, all of that.
It takes educating yourself. I think also just the way our culture and media, especially around food, is set up, is people are so conditioned to listen to what someone else tells them is the right thing for them to eat, rather than listening to their own body and figuring out how they feel after they eat something. And while I'm definitely, if we're in a one-on-one counseling situation and you're telling me like a keto diet or a really low carb diet really works for you and you feel good and you're doing all this and everything checks out, who am I to sit here and tell you like, no, you can't do that? However, like if I'm looking at for myself, I know my body and I know I would feel miserable and I know I can't, like, that's not for me. And so I think really, like, in my capacity online, I can only give generalized advice and talk about what the research shows. But as individuals, we have the ability to, learn about the different kind of general nutrition advice, but then listen to your body and figure out what style of eating helps you feel your best.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. That does make sense. And that does tend to quiet all the noise that we hear out there, doesn't it? If we just stop and just pay attention to what, obviously what our own blood sugar levels are, how they are responding, but ultimately how we're feeling.
Yeah.
Got to listen to that inner wisdom, right?
Yes.
Do you have any tips, maybe some steps that we can take when we're shopping for food? And this brings back this is something I remember watching a video to you with you online where you were shopping at Costco. And this really got my attention because we're Costco shoppers. And a lot of the things you were putting in your cart and talking about and explaining are the same things that I buy. So we do have a lot in common. I love this. Maybe that obviously got my attention, but that's something that's real important too. Is there important steps that you can say? I mean, as far as maybe making a list before they go, or is it just making a plan? So how do you handle shopping trips?
I think having a plan and also knowing those things that, the things that you use all the time, the things you rely on all the time. And for me, this is more just like, it's not specific to diabetes, but more just like organizational, is like, if you rely on these all the time, don't wait till they're gone, to replenish them. But also then the whole like planning ahead of, do you have a few proteins on hand? If you're able to financially, do you have a few vegetables on hand, frozen vegetables, frozen fruit, like not being afraid to do that kind of thing. I'm a big proponent of a list, but I know different things work for different people. The going into the grocery store without a list is a bit chaotic in my mind, but that's just me.
Right. The list is not always in order of what aisle you're on, right? I've done that before too.
But no, I don't think I'm all that different than the average person. But one thing I do try to be good about is knowing the things that like for me, I love to bake. And usually a lot of times what we're having for breakfast is something that I've like baked on the weekend and then we're having out. So like I make these breakfast bars for my kids every weekend. And then like, that's what they have, the same thing for breakfast every morning, because that's what they want. And that's what gets us out the door. And like my style of baking usually involves oats and almond flour. And I know that life is a lot easier if I can keep those ingredients on hand. Same thing for you. If you have like a go-to dinner or a go-to thing you like to have for lunch, if keeping those things on hand is going to make life easier, then that's what you do.
Yeah. It is all about that consistency. And there's a lot of things we can't control with life or diabetes, but if we can keep those constants, those consistent things on hand, just like you say, it does make the process of cooking and planning and all of that much easier. Actually, this kind of reminds me of something. Just on a side note, I had a guide that I gave out to a lot of my followers, and it was basically some delicious recipes, balanced recipes that included just 12 basic ingredients. And it points to exactly what you say. If you have these 12s and the things, it's like the oils, it's the cauliflower rice, it's certain vegetables that, you can build meals around. It can be done. It can make it easy. And so, and you can make those trips to Costco easier, more productive if, just like you say, if you're just keeping them on hand in the pantry, all right, ready to go. Yeah. Well, very nice. Speaking of baking, can you give us an example? You were talking about the breakfast bars. So, what are the ingredients in those breakfast bars, just to kind of showcase how ingredients can come together and be balanced?
So my go-to formula for baking, especially if it's a flour base, is I use almond flour and then oat flour, but it's a lot cheaper to just buy oats and grind them up. It gives a nice, if you're using a leavening agent too, like baking soda or baking powder, it gives it a nice fluffy texture. It's also a lot more nutrient dense because it's a lower carbohydrate, but higher fat, higher fiber, higher protein. And so it's a lot more satisfying. And my thing that I like to do with desserts, and I'm very proud of because they also taste delicious. I'm not like, I think we've had enough of the cardboard tasting desserts of the 90s and early 2000s that none of us want to go back there. But they're just a lot more satisfying because they have that higher fat content, higher fiber, and higher protein content. But I most of the desserts I make can double as breakfast because we want fiber and protein and fat at breakfast, And so that's kind of my formula or my flour base that I use. But there's a number of different ways that you can, and I talk about this in my cookbook, the second one, the dessert cookbook, that there's a number of different ways you can make a dessert more blood sugar friendly. You can cut back on the sugar if you want to. But what I try to say is you don't have to. That doesn't have to be your first way. You can change up the flours. Like I said, you can try alternative flours. And once you find what works and what you enjoy the texture of, then you can start to experiment a little bit more. You can have those things on hand and it can become easier. You can try adding things like plain Greek yogurt to decrease saturated fat and increase protein content. You can add in things. I know people always balk at it, but it's, add in some beans. You'd be shocked if you puree chickpeas and whatever your preferred flour is, and it comes up with the texture of cookie dough. You can also, play around with your fat source. We talked about avocados. I have one of the very first recipes. This is blast from the past. I haven't made these in a long time. One of the very first recipes I ever published on my website was for avocado cookies, because you can use avocado instead of butter, and you can increase fiber that way, increase plant-based fat. But there's a whole host of strategies, and I go through them in the Easy Diabetes Desserts Cookbook. But you don't just have to. You certainly can reduce sugar if you want to, but you don't have to.
Yeah. And those are some great tips. And I'm an almond flour fan too. That's really the only flour I have. It reminds me of a recipe that I have. Have you ever done brownies using black beans?
Yes.
Black bean and avocado. It's one of the recipes that I've used as well. So that's really good tips. It is, and it really fools people. Sometimes I'll just pull them out, if I have a get together, if I'm going somewhere, and I'll bring some along. And I, it's always a guessing game as far as, what's in these brownies. And of course, we do use sugar. It's either honey or coconut sugar sometimes. So, whatever, good quality sugar we have on hand. Yeah. But it's just like you say, I mean, when we make and bake and cook using real ingredients, it can be done. It can be done. It can be enjoyed. And we have it's easier to bolus for it too, isn't it? Because we generally have a better idea of what's in it. And again, experimenting over time is going to tell us, what type, how much insulin might be required.
Yeah. And to that end, though, I do think we have to acknowledge that's not always possible. But there are a whole lot more store-bought options out there that are blood sugar friendly no longer means, hey, we just made this low fat, low sugar. It's actually the opposite. Like we've got some higher protein, some higher fiber, some higher fat items on grocery store shelves that are actually pretty delicious.
Good. Yeah.
And there's a lot of great brands out there. Because like I love baking too, but you also have to consider like, buying something pre-made isn't bad. It's not, sometimes we need convenience. We need to be able to have access to that. And when you're living with diabetes, I think now much more so than 20, 30 years ago, we actually have products at the grocery store that are good and that we can rely on.
Right. Yeah. Would you say too, and this probably goes without saying that, and this is funny because I think the talk within the diabetes community is that we have to eat different. The term diabetes or the diabetic diet, which I cringe when I hear that word because, or just having to explain, what we're eating, why we're eating it. And you've just proven the fact that no, it's all real good food. It's obviously going to satisfy everybody, not only our taste buds, but how we feel and how our body responds to it. But how do you respond to that labeling of how we should eat versus the average American that doesn't have a chronic disease?
I mean, the quote unquote diabetes diet it's just a balanced way of eating. Mm-hmm. It's not, I know several healthcare practitioners, dietitians, and physicians alike who say, if everybody supposedly ate the diabetes friendly diet, like we'd all feel a lot better probably.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Where I get a little so on that, like when you say like a diabetes diet, there's a lot of things within that we'll see that just my personal viewpoint as a dietitian does not align with. Like, I'm not going to sit here and tell someone with diabetes, like, oh, you have to have whole wheat pasta instead of white pasta, or you have to have brown rice instead of white rice, because the fiber benefit there is minuscule. If they would rather have white rice, and then we can add protein sources, we can add vegetables, we can add, an oil-based sauce to add some plant-based fat. I would much rather them do that and enjoy their meal. And they're going to get a whole lot more nutritional benefit from adding those things on top of it. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely.
So I think it can mean different things for different people, and like that, kind of what you'd see on like the American Diabetes Association website or something like that. Right. But it goes back to just making things work for you. Mm-hmm. You don't have to follow a set of kind of arbitrary rules that are just out there.
Yeah. And it's definitely not a one size fits all type of a quick fix, when it comes to what we decide we will eat in a given day. So that is really good. So tell us a little bit about your book. You've got the Easy Diabetes Cookbook and the Easy Diabetes Desserts Cookbook.
Yes, excuse me. I have the Easy Diabetes Cookbook came out in 2021. Am I getting that right? 2021. Mm-hmm. And the Easy Diabetes Desserts Cookbook is kind of like a sister book that came out in 2022. If you have both books, you'll notice that they're formatted very similarly. They're about the same length. They're meant to complement each other. And they're just kind of my type of cooking. One of the things that when I was approached about writing the first one is I said, I don't want it to look like a diabetes cookbook. I don't, you know what I'm saying too. They all have this kind of like,
they do.
Meal planny look to them. Like, and so we were, I pushed for the photographer that we used for both of them because she knows how to make food look like art, and she knows how to make it look appetizing. And that's one of the things I'm very proud of. People always ask if I took the photos, and I'm like, oh my goodness, no. Each recipe in each book, there's about 60 recipes in each book. They all have their own photo, so you can see what they look like. And they all use kind of some of the same ingredients that we talked about. I'm very proud of them.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes, I can't wait to look closer at them. I haven't had one in my hands yet. I've just looked at them online, so it's great information. And they do include the macronutrients per serving.
Yes, we have nutrition information for every recipe, and there it's listed at the bottom there. And only thing I always tell people
Real
is just
helpful.
remember, if you substitute ingredients, that's going to change.
Again, know your
yeah,
food, right?
yeah,
Good stuff.
yeah,
Well, I appreciate it. It's been great to get to know you today, and I appreciate your time and sharing. Those 9 food principles really do apply for all of us, especially women as we're aging too. I know there's a lot of different stuff going on, and not only with our blood sugar, but our hormones as we're getting older. So those are some good tips, just to lean into and to take. So share how our listeners can find you and get a hold of your cookbooks.
So if you head to milkandhoneynutrition.com, you can find links to pretty much everything. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest as Milk in Honey Nutrition, the letter N in there. Mm-hmm. And then on TikTok, if you're on TikTok, I'm Diabetes Nutritionist. And then the cookbooks, there's a page on my website for the cookbooks where it links out to all the retailers that carry it. But you can pretty much get them from any retailer: Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Target, Books A Million. A lot of like smaller, if you like to shop small bookshops, they will have it, or you can ask them. The big suppliers carry it. So
yeah, it's really good. And we'll link all of that in the show notes to make it even easier for everybody to get a hold of your cookbooks and to get started. So awesome. Well, thank you, Mary Ellen. I appreciate your time and your expertise, sharing your story and your hope-filled strategies on our relationship with food and cooking here with our listeners. So
thank you for having me.
You are very welcome. And I'm wishing you all a wonderful rest of your day, and we'll be back here next week. We'll see you then. Thank you for listening to the Type 1 and Midlife podcast. Head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It's very much appreciated. Thank you. And be sure to check us out at abundanthealthwithmelissa.com for our free resources. See you next week.